Hello, my name is Matt, host of the Pirate History Podcast. Pirates rank among the most mythologized and romanticized of all historical figures. It can become easy to forget that pirates were real people that had real-world concerns. If you like tales of high-seas adventure, daring do, and also want to learn more about who Blackbeard supported to be king, you can learn more about all of that at the Pirate History Podcast.
Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 3, Episode 30. Barebone's Parliament. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome our new members of the House of Lords. Ido Uziel, Earl of Gibraltar, Baron Ryan, and Zabinek, Baron Belfin. Like all of our patrons, they can now listen to the podcast ad-free. Go to patreon.com/PaxBritannica to find out more. Last time, we took a closer look at a few of the religious offshoots which had grown during the Civil Wars and the early years of the English Republic. The Baptists, split between general and particular, largely depending on their belief in predestination. The Quakers, who preferred the light within over any national church. The Ranters, who exemplified the world turned upside down. And the Fifth Monarchists, who firmly believed that the world was just a few short years away from the second coming of Christ and the end of days. They were determined to prepare the Commonwealth for his return. With the Rump Parliament swept away, this last group saw an opportunity. Oliver Cromwell and the army would decide the form of a new government, and they hoped this was the first step towards the rule of the saints. Today, we're going to welcome, and say goodbye to, this new government. After his coup, Cromwell left the House of Commons, empty and locked behind him, and rode for Whitehall. Here, he met the Council of State, and he told them what he'd done. He also informed them, in no uncertain terms, that because the Council of State owed its authority to the Rump, and the Rump was now gone, they were all just private individuals now. Quote, "Gentlemen, if you are met here as private persons, you shall not be disturbed, but if as a Council of State, there is no place for you." John Bradshaw, a former Lord President of the Council, the chief judge at Charles I's trial, and devoted servant of the Republican regime, was not prepared to accept that. He told Cromwell, quote, "Sir, we have heard what you did at the House in the morning, and before many hours all England will hear it. But, sir, you are mistaken to think that the Parliament is dissolved, for no power under heaven can dissolve them but themselves. Therefore, you take notice of that." End quote. Bradshaw was referring to one of the earliest fruits of the First English Revolution, when the Long Parliament had been young, civil war had yet to be fought, and the king had given his assent to an act requiring Parliament's own agreement to dissolve. At the time, the threat of unilateral dissolution had come from the king. But how things change in a decade. Some of the men present were MPs, and they were obviously appalled at what had just happened, and they backed Bradshaw up. Bradshaw would be proven correct, in a way, but it will take a few years before that becomes clear. Right now, Cromwell's reply was standing next to him. Several soldiers. The Council of State followed the Rump into dissolution. In the days after the dissolution of the Rump, no one was quite sure what was going to happen. Even Cromwell, the prime figure in this drama, was improvising, making it up as he went along. 2 days after the coup, the army issued a statement. In this, Cromwell and the Council of Officers described what had happened, why they had acted as they had, and why they'd had no choice. As we covered 2 episodes ago, this was when one might expect the bill which Parliament had been debating and which had sparked the coup to be presented. What better time to set the narrative? But it doesn't appear. Instead, we get the damning but vague description of a parliament determined to prolong itself, which had forced the army's hand. As news of Cromwell's coup spread, declarations in support flowed to Westminster. The vast majority of these pledges came from the army, garrisons and regiments across England, Ireland and Scotland, but not all. Some came from the navy too. This had been a military coup, and the military supported it. Many officers had been calling for the Rump to go for a long time. For another week, the Council of Officers debated what they would do. There needed to be some kind of government, and Cromwell was determined that he wouldn't lead it, and that Parliament would be restored, in time. He repeatedly insisted that, quote, "it," being Parliament, "is only suspended. 'Tis a sword taken out of a madman's hand till he recover his senses." End quote. On the 30th of April, a new Executive Council was established, made up of officers and former MPs, with a majority of 6 being officers. This council was formed out of necessity, and there was no intention that it would become the new government. It was a placeholder, while they debated what would come next. In the meantime, they prioritised certain policies. The Mayor of London was told to commute any death sentences that weren't for murder. The commissioners responsible for the propagation of the gospel in Wales, which had been allowed to lapse by the Rump and was one of the final straws for many in the army, was instructed by Cromwell to continue as normal. Quote, "I would advise you to go on cheerfully in the work as formerly to promote these good things." End quote. He promised that, until a supreme power could settle the issue, the commissioners would receive support from Cromwell himself. But a new government needed to be established, and the council was going to decide it. So what would this new government look like? The 2 prevailing arguments on this body were led by 2 officers, John Lambert and Thomas Harrison. Both were talented military commanders, and both had devoted significant thought to the future of the nation. But they had very different ideas about what that future would look like. John Lambert has appeared in our story multiple times now, usually in a military context. He was a highly effective commander, especially in the Third Civil War, when he is credited with identifying the weakness in the Scottish position at Dunbar, defeating the hardline Covenanter remonstrants at Hamilton, securing a beachhead over the Firth of Forth, before, debatably, outshining Cromwell in the Worcester campaign. But in the aftermath of that battle, Lambert turned his attention to civilian politics, despite having no official position in the government. Lambert grew increasingly frustrated with Parliament, for personal as well as other reasons, and so he fully backed Cromwell when the Rump was dissolved. In these debates, Lambert displayed his keen interest in constitutional concerns. He proposed an executive body of about 10 to 12 men be established to govern the Commonwealth, decide on a new form of government, and then hand power over. His argument did not win the day, but he'll get another shot. Opposing him was Thomas Harrison. Like Lambert, Harrison had been calling for the end of the Rump for some time before Cromwell finished it off, and he was so passionate about it, he began to annoy Cromwell. Harrison, quote, "is an honest man, and aims at good things, yet from the impatience of his spirit will not wait the Lord's leisure, but hurries me on to that which he and all honest men will have cause to repent." End quote. Harrison had good reason to hurry. As I mentioned last week, Harrison was a Fifth Monarchist. After the Rump was dissolved, it entered Fifth Monarchist prophecy. Perhaps it was the Rump, not the Stuart monarchy, which was the 4th beast described in the Book of Daniel. That would mean that the path to the rule of the saints and the return of Christ was now clear. Harrison urged the council to borrow a form of government from the Bible, the Jewish Sanhedrin, made up of 70 godly representatives appointed by independent congregations from across the Commonwealth. Harris's argument was based on his Fifth Monarchist belief that the Sanhedrin was a vital precondition for Jesus' return. This body of godly true believers would rule the nation until the Second Coming, which, as we heard last time, was scheduled to take place in 1656, just 3 years from now. Also like Lambert, Harrison's argument did not win the day. Instead, the council agreed to appoint a new assembly of 140 men. This is sometimes seen as more of a defeat for Lambert than it was for Harrison, but neither really got what they wanted here. They would not be nominated by independent congregations, although many congregations did send recommendations for the council's consideration. They were instead nominated by the Council of Officers, who saw godliness as just one qualification and not the only one. 6 members would come from Wales, 6 from Scotland, and 6 from Ireland. This was the first time that the 4 nations of Britain and Ireland would have representation in the same parliament, although that statement has caveats. Firstly, as we'll cover in a moment, the nominated assembly, its official name, was not meant to be a parliament. But secondly, the representatives for Ireland were not Irish, but instead New English or New Protestants. 3 of them were colonels in the army, including Henry Cromwell, and 1 was the pamphleteer Vincent Gookin. We heard from Gookin in our episodes on the transplantation of Ireland. He'd railed against the more hardline zealotry of the New Protestants, but, for now, he's yet to put pen to paper. Most members of the nominated assembly were gentlemen, although many of them were of a lower social status than would be expected for pre-war MPs. There were a few tradesmen among the ranks, but not many. About 60 members were university educated or were trained lawyers, with 14 or 15 barristers among them. There were 119 justices of the peace, and of these, 89 had been appointed before 1650, so these weren't revolutionary figures put into place as the world turned upside down. But even more had been part of parliamentary commissions during the civil wars, helping to bind their communities to parliamentary government. Viscount Lisle, a veteran parliamentarian, Commonwealth statesman, and one-time absentee Lord Deputy of Ireland, was also nominated. This is all to say that despite the criticisms which the nominated assembly will attract, it was not a bunch of uneducated, illiterate zealots. But religious radicals were represented. The popular name of the body, Barebone's Parliament, comes from critics picking out one of these radicals, praise God Barbon, or Barebone, a successful London leather merchant and 5th monarchist, brother to Fear God Barebone. Fear God doesn't appear in this story, but it's important to know that their parents at least had a consistent theme. But Praise God, despite becoming the symbol of how radical and untested the nominated assembly was also a veteran member of the London Common Council. Speaking of religious radicals and 5th monarchists, only about 14 of the nominated members can be identified as 5th monarchists, despite Harrison's hopes. There were others who leaned towards more radical religious thought, but they were usually outnumbered by more moderate independents. Cromwell was also determined to avoid military rule, and so he persuaded the rest of the council not to nominate too many serving army officers to the body. Even so, both Robert Blake and George Monk, former army officers but now generals at sea, were nominated, although they were far too busy fighting the Dutch to attend. This restriction also doesn't seem to have applied to the Irish representatives either, because half of them were colonels, although, like Blake and Monk, they were rarely, if ever, in attendance. There were English representatives who were serving officers, but they were far and away outnumbered by civilian members. The other disappointment for Harrison was that the nominated assembly was still a placeholder. It would not govern until the Second Coming of Christ, but instead for a fixed term. Its business would include the reforms which the Rump had dragged its feet in delivering, and the setting up of a new, permanent form of government. Then it would dissolve itself. With this agreed, a list of nominees was drawn up on the 6th of June, and then the summons went out. Writs arrived at the homes and offices of 140 men. Some declined or were unavailable, and replacements were found, sometimes at very short notice. They were summoned to meet on the 4th of July in the council chamber of Whitehall. That was still a month away, and in the meantime, essential government work needed to be done. As the only remaining authority in the Commonwealth, Cromwell and the Council of Officers had to continue to jury-rig many of the essentials of administration, like the assessment for tax, which was due to expire that summer. It was deeply unpopular. It was a tax. But without this, the state would have no money, and most importantly for the Council of Officers, they would have no means to pay the vast armies and navies currently under arms. The Council, led by Cromwell and on his authority, declared that the assessment would continue unchanged for another 6 months. That would give the new nominated assembly some time to set up a replacement. Cromwell also issued declarations with better news, at least for the English. George Monk's victory at the Battle of the Gabbard. The declaration is full of praise for God, and recommended Bible passages and psalms for people to celebrate the victory. A few weeks later, Dutch ambassadors arrived to discuss a way to end the war, which we touched on in those episodes. Again, Cromwell and the impromptu Council of State were the only authority that could negotiate. But though the Lord General was usually in favour of conciliation with the other Protestant republic, he wasn't very conciliatory in this meeting. Quote, "You have appealed to the judgment of heaven. The Lord has declared against you. After the defeats you have undergone, your only resource is to associate yourselves with your formidable neighbour, to work together for the propagation of the kingdom of Christ, and the deliverance of the people ground under oppression." End quote. This approach was either a negotiating tactic, coming on strong allowed more space for compromise, or it was the ever-providential Cromwell, seeing the overwhelming victory of the Gabbard and the subsequent blockade of the Netherlands as a message from God. Either way, there'd be no peace yet. Once the nominated assembly gathered, it was Cromwell who opened it with a speech. According to the letters, writings and speeches of Oliver Cromwell, there are 3 different versions of the speech, with some notable variations indicating different sources, but they all have things in common. First, they're all really long. Cromwell spoke for about 2 hours, and the packed room in the middle of summer was stifling. Say one thing for Oliver Cromwell, say he likes to talk. Secondly, Cromwell rambles and repeats himself. And thirdly, like many of Cromwell's speeches, it's more of a sermon than a dry political address. He calls on God's wisdom a lot, he cries and gets emotional, and urges the members to do God's will, as he interprets it. In this speech, Cromwell justified his dissolution of the Rump. They had refused to establish a new representative body, and instead had attempted to continue sitting through recruiter elections which had no safeguards against royalists. He reminded the nominees that they were there to do a job, they were there to do God's work, and he urged them not to overreach. He also referred to the role of the army in putting them all there, which may or may not have been an implicit threat. But, most interestingly, is that Cromwell urged this assembly of the godly to enshrine freedom of religious conscience. Quote, "Have a care of the whole flock. Love the sheep, love the lambs, love all, tender all, cherish and countenance all, in all things that are good. And if the poorest Christian, the most mistaken Christian, shall desire to live peaceably and quietly under you, I say, if any shall but desire to lead a life of godliness and honesty, let him be protected." End quote. This is a call for toleration of any Christian, and can be read as toleration for Catholics if they lived peacefully. What were they, if not mistaken Christians? This is Cromwell's sincere, independent desire for freedom of conscience, and one of his more appealing qualities. Cromwell made clear that the nominated assembly was temporary. They had a job to do, and they had limited time to do it. The assembly would have a term of 16 months, and should have decided its successor within 13 months. To quote from Jonathan Fitzgibbons, "The nominated assembly was not considered a change of government. Rather, it was meant to expedite pressing social, religious and legal reforms ahead of the return to government by elected parliaments in the not-too-distant future." Once Cromwell finished speaking, the assembly got to work. Traditionally, the nominated assembly is not seen in a positive light, but historian Barry Coward is very complimentary about it. The Assembly combined energetic zeal with administrative competence. Very quickly, a veteran MP, Francis Roos, was elected as Speaker. His clerk was Henry Scobell, who had held the same post in the Rump. It voted to add 5 members to itself. These were John Lambert, Thomas Harrison, Major General Desborough, Colonel Matthew Tomlinson, and, no prizes for getting this one, Lord General Oliver Cromwell. It created a new Council of State. Cromwell was, of course, put on it, and then began to enact some long-awaited reforms. The Assembly met at 8 a.m. sharp, 6 days a week, far more regularly than previous parliaments. Business was streamlined through standing committees, each given a remit, and then these committees were led by a committee of committees. In its short 5 months of life, because it won't last long, the nominated Assembly passed 30 statutes, with even more in progress by the time it ended. These addressed subjects as varied as law reform, creditor and debtor relief, making marriage a civil ceremony. It improved the conditions that the mentally unwell were kept in, and it continued the process of integrating Scotland into the Commonwealth. The recommendations of the Hale Commission were being enacted when the Assembly died, as were reforms to how the state collected revenue and the abolition of the hated excise tax. Both of those works in progress were part of the reason the Assembly ended, but we'll cover that in a moment. What the nominated Assembly was not intended to do was call itself a parliament. Cromwell never called it one, and he was a bit annoyed when it began to call itself one and allowed itself to be called one. It began to meet in St. Stephen's Chapel, where the old Stuart parliaments had once met, and it began to act and be seen as a parliament. We can see that in its mocking names. It was sometimes called the Little Parliament, and, of course, Barebone's Parliament is its much more famous nickname. In terms of membership, that radical minority, Fifth monarchists like Harrison and Barebone, became an albatross around the neck of the nominated Assembly. It had many enemies from all across the political spectrum, and so it was easy for them to paint the whole body as a shower of low-born religious and political fruitcakes. Despite the rest of the Assembly not being as radical as the Fifth monarchists, they still had ideas that went far beyond the pre-revolutionary norm. But in revolutionary politics, divisions could be narrow and still deep. So it was with Barebone's Parliament. Disputes between the radical minority and the more moderate majority increasingly slowed things down. Cromwell himself stayed out of affairs as much as he could, despite his positions in both the Assembly and the Council of State. He sat on the Committee for Religious Matters, and his influence helps explain why their proposals were in keeping with his views. That committee suggested a broadly tolerant national church, which kept parish churches organised by the state and funded through tithes, but without any mechanisms for coercing attendance. These proposals, which were radical compared to before the Civil Wars or even the Presbyterian-dominated Long Parliament, were not acceptable to the radicals now in the nominated Assembly. One of those was Thomas Harrison. He'd tried to get tithes abolished outright through a straight-up vote in the Assembly, but he was outmanoeuvred and the question was taken out of his hands and put into that committee. When the Assembly voted to abolish the Court of Chancery and reform the law, horrifying the lawyers in attendance, Harrison was appointed to the committee which would draft the statutes to do so. He also joined the Excise Committee, which was due to abolish it and find a more popular method of raising revenue. All three of these issues, religion, law, tax, these were at the heart of the divisions within the nominated Assembly. The radicals, especially Harrison, had very firm ideas about what they wanted to happen, but Ian Gentles is very explicit about why those ideas never materialised. Quote, "There are several reasons for the failure of the radical agenda in Barebone's Parliament, but among them must be counted Harrison's lack of political aptitude, his impatience for committee work, and his reluctance to undertake the hard slogging required to accomplish significant change." End quote. To sum him up, he just wasn't very good at politics. As summer turned to autumn, divisions in the nominated Assembly grew worse. Moderates began to stay away, which only made the divides wider between those who stayed. Cromwell saw this and complained that, quote, "the sober men of that meeting did withdraw," end quote, which left the unsober men with greater influence. In its final weeks, Barebone's Parliament crashed on 4 particular rocks. The first was tithes. There were many in the Assembly, not just Fifth Monarchists, who wanted tithes abolished. They were seen as unnecessary and unbiblical. They were means of supporting a national church which was itself not popular among the radicals. But their attack on tithes was also an attack on property, because when the Reformation had taken place, and the monasteries and religious orders were dissolved, their properties and rights were sold off. This didn't just include land and buildings, but the right to tithe local communities. So for more than a century, lay notables had been profiting from tithes. It was seen as a form of rent. It was property. And any attack on property was far more dangerous than any concern of religion. Now, there were those who countered that previous parliaments had abolished bishops and seized their property for religious reasons as well as for others. Where had this pearl-clutching been then? But besides any theological reasoning, I think this argument failed to win converts because, firstly, the bishops had no influence over Parliament when they were abolished and their lands seized. Secondly, there were a lot more people due to be affected by abolishing tithes than there had been bishops. And thirdly, those episcopal lands could be bought at a bargain, whereas abolishing tithes could only lose people money. Despite how popular abolishing tithes was in certain parts of society, like the army, or parishioners who had to pay them, it helped rally the moderate resistance to radicals in Barebone's Parliament. The second rock was the law. The Court of Chancery had been facing reform for years at this point. It was seen as inefficient, backlogged and corrupt, and it soon fell into the crosshairs of the Assembly as one of the reforms they had been charged with addressing. The radicals proposed abolishing it, and possibly slimming down English law at the same time. Some wanted to replace it with Mosaic law, as in the 10 Commandments. Others just wanted it streamlined and made more accessible for ordinary people. This fired up opposition from moderates who were very concerned about what exactly would replace the Chancery Court. How streamlined would the law be? Were the radicals trying to abolish the law without having anything ready to replace it? This doesn't seem to have been the case. It's a bit confused, but it certainly rolls into the wider view of the Assembly as irresponsible. But it also received opposition from lawyers, who were quite happy to keep the law as complicated and corrupt as it already was. To put a generous light on it, they'd been trained in it, and they didn't want their expertise to disappear. The Assembly also purged the Justices of the Peace of the incompetent or corrupt JPs, which was just continuing with rump policy. But many of those purged were powerful, or rich, or related to the powerful or the rich, and so the snowball of opposition continued to roll downhill. The third was the fear that the radicals intended the Assembly to govern as saints, in perpetuity, until Christ returned. The 2 previous points played into this fear. Most of these reforms had been neglected by the rump, and the Assembly had been charged to implement them. But the body's legitimacy had always been flimsy, and its authority to make such wide-ranging changes was being questioned. It did not help that the Fifth Monarchists were black and white thinkers, and anything that didn't fit their worldview was treated with contempt. Presbyterians, Royalists, Episcopalians, more moderate independents were politically attacked in the Assembly. This sometimes spilled into physical attacks in the streets. Though the Fifth Monarchists and those who echoed their holier-than-thou approach were a small minority, they tarnished the whole body. The fourth rock was taxation. The tax burden on Commonwealth subjects was monumental compared to before the revolutions. The monthly assessment levied from England was £120,000. That was about the same as one parliamentary subsidy from Charles I's early reign. Remember how much effort, how much political capital was spent by him to try and get one of those, and how often he still failed? This was being efficiently raised every month. But to say that the assessment was unpopular would heavily understate the strength of feeling. But this money primarily went towards the military, the army and the navy, and both were needed. The navy was fighting the Dutch and protecting English shipping on the seas, and the army was garrisoning the country. Scotland was facing a not insignificant rebellion at this point, which we'll cover in a future episode. The Assembly therefore looked at ways to replace the assessment and somehow square the circle. Some bright spark suggested that the army, or at least its high-ranking officers, do their patriotic duty and not get paid for a year. There were not many takers. Then the Assembly tried to abolish the assessment outright, without replacing it with another method of raising revenue, and the vote was only narrowly defeated. This was, at a minimum, a very ungrateful gesture from the Assembly towards the institution which had just put them there. It was also playing with fire. Both the Long Parliament and the Rump Parliament had tried to mess with the army's pay and been burned, and they'd been actual parliaments with actual legitimacy, not this bastardized offshoot of the army's own making. The Assembly further angered the army when it voted to reject the terms of surrender for a notable royalist, which had been agreed between him and the army. This was deeply disrespectful to their honour. The Assembly's reputation was increasingly that of a dangerous body which was whipping up unrest and destroying far more than they were building. Tithes, the law, and taxation were all in need of reform, and the Assembly had been gathered to implement that reform. But they were either going too far too fast without preparing any alternatives, or they were vastly overreaching and facing off against powerful interests. It was looking more and more like, to quote Coward, Barebone's Parliament seemed to be more concerned with tearing down than reforming the political, social, and religious order. End quote. When John Lilburne, the leveller who'd been arrested by every government he'd ever known, was arrested by this one too, there were riots in London streets. This move should have strengthened the Assembly's image for preserving the social order, but instead it just seemed to show that even when doing the quote-unquote right thing, they bungled it and made things worse. The Assembly could possibly have survived if it kept the support of at least one man. That man was, of course, Oliver Cromwell, but though he had been instrumental in setting it up, he was increasingly frustrated with the Assembly and with the radicals within it. He was just as concerned about the changes being discussed and proposed and voted on in the Assembly as any other moderate, but I think Cromwell's main problem with the Assembly was more than that. By and large, they were ignoring the plea he'd made, as he opened the body, for religious toleration. By the end of November, Cromwell himself began to be called a man of sin and the old dragon by Fifth Monarchist preachers, which he took pretty well. He invited one Fifth Monarchist, Christopher Feake, to a meeting to discuss it, but it didn't go well. After this lengthy conversation, Feake remained unconvinced of Cromwell's godly intentions and believed he sought a lenient peace with the Dutch, which the Fifth Monarchists firmly opposed. Though Cromwell had been patient, by the end of December, Feake would be one of the first Fifth Monarchists arrested, but by then the political situation would once again be in flux. Whether they treasured freedom of conscience, the rights of property, the rule of law, or the military, enough of its members believed that the Assembly could too easily be commandeered by the radicals. Once again, the sword would have to be taken out of the madman's hand. Matters came to a head on the 10th of December. It was a Saturday, and the Assembly held a vote on tithes. The vote was whether to abolish them. The final vote was 56 to 54 against abolition, and the deciding vote was cast by Speaker Roos. This was exceptionally close, and it terrified the moderates. They should have outnumbered the radicals easily, but with so many members staying away, their majority had vanished to nearly nothing. Something had to be done. The following day was a Sunday, the one day a week that the Assembly did not meet. The moderates met with Speaker Roos, and they plotted. And for once, someone didn't talk. The following morning, the moderates carried out their plot. Like all good plans, the key was timing. Remember how I mentioned that the Assembly started at 8 a.m. sharp? Many of the radicals attended a regular Monday morning prayer meeting at the nearby St. Anne Blackfriars, about half an hour away from St. Stephen's Chapel, where the Assembly met. Well, on this morning, a bunch of moderates arrived much earlier than 8 a.m. and took their places. The Speaker was there too, and there were a few radicals scattered about the place. Suddenly, the Speaker opened the floor ahead of schedule, and Sir Charles Wolseley began to speak. Wolseley was a member of the Council of State, and he began to rail against the nominated Assembly. He criticised their actions and their inactions, and poured scorn on the radicals. Those few radicals in attendance attempted to defend themselves and the Assembly, but they weren't sure exactly what they were defending against, and even if they did, the Speaker wasn't letting them talk. After Wolseley, another moderate rose and attacked the Assembly. Then another, and another. More members began to filter in, especially once word that something unusual was happening had reached St. Anne's, but the balance still remained with the moderates when a motion was suddenly proposed. The sitting of this Parliament any longer would not be for the good of the Commonwealth, and that it would be fit for them to resign their power to the Lord General. The Speaker didn't even put it to a vote. He simply got out of his chair and walked out, carrying the mace, and he was followed by about 80 members, all voting with their feet. This left about 30 radicals behind, confused, surprised, wondering what the hell had just happened. At some point later, in a clearly prearranged move, Colonel William Gough and Lieutenant Colonel Francis White came in with some soldiers and made it very clear. The Assembly was done. Meanwhile, a delegation of the moderates, or perhaps saboteurs, rode to Whitehall, informed Cromwell of what they'd done, and gave him a signed document handing all powers back to him. And like that, the nominated Assembly was dead. The Fifth Monarchists and other radicals were left fuming that their opportunity to forge a godly nation on their terms had been stolen from them. But there was not much they could do. Not yet. For his part, Cromwell claimed, and appeared to be, surprised at this turn of events, and historians have long debated how much he knew beforehand. I tend to lean towards him not knowing the details, that a specific action was going to take place that Monday, or that frustration with the Assembly had reached this critical level. But he absolutely knew that there was frustration with the Assembly from many corners of the Commonwealth. He shared that frustration, after all, and I can certainly believe that he had heard rumours that something was going to happen, even if he wasn't brought into the plot himself. The nominated Assembly died because the moderates within it no longer believed it could be trusted to settle the nation, and because its founder and protector, the army, didn't want to protect it. The rank and file had been alienated by the Assembly's attack on their pay, the officers had been offended by their disregard of their honour, and many soldiers and officers, including, to the very top, Oliver Cromwell, were appalled at the Assembly's lack of toleration for religious differences. It was a smoothly executed coup. Civilian saboteurs marching out with their abdication, soldiers marching in with their guns, and all power was once again invested in the Lord General of the Army, Oliver Cromwell. He was, once again, the most powerful man in 3 kingdoms. One man who was not surprised by the end of Barebone's Parliament was John Lambert. His vision of a new government had been defeated earlier in the year, but this had not stopped him thinking about the future. As the Assembly had looked increasingly unstable, Lambert had begun to put these thoughts down on paper, and so it was that just 3 days after the nominated Assembly died, Lambert presented Cromwell with the results of his work. The first written constitution in English history, the instrument of government. Thank you to my House of Lords, in particular, the King's favourites Mike Sanders and Fernando Lopez Ojeda, the Duke of Ormond, Brendan Bonner, the Marquis of Hull, Steve Cloutier, and the Earl of Surrey, John Kruger. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to join their ranks and listen to the podcast without ads. Thank you to everyone who has left a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or told a friend about the show, because that is the best way to help the show grow. For other great podcasts on the Airwave Network, check out airwavemedia.com. And thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.